If you're watching this, it's because you're either thinking about getting an iPod or you just got an iPod and you have some questions. In this video, I hope to answer all the basic questions that you may have about owning an iPod. A little bit about me. I've been using an iPod for over 20 years, and I'm a regular on the iPod subreddit. And if you've been on there recently, you've probably noticed that there have been more and more basic questions being posted every day. Some of these are good questions, and they spark a healthy amount of discourse. But most of them go ignored because they are being asked too frequently and can be easily answered with a few minutes of research. So I hope this video will help with that. These are too frequently asked questions about iPods that people don't have time to address. These are the questions I'll be covering. If you're looking for the answer to a particular question, you can skip to the time codes. Otherwise, feel free to watch the whole video to learn as much as you can about the iPod. And if you have a question that I won't be covering, post it in the comments and maybe I'll make another video if this one is successful enough. All right, let's begin with the first question. Should I buy an iPod? Right off the bat, first question, I can't answer this one for you. Obviously, I bought several iPods, so I'd be a hypocrite if I said you shouldn't buy an iPod. But at the end of the day, this is a question you have to answer yourself. So I'll answer your question with another question. Why haven't you bought one yet? Whatever the reason, I'll either resolve it by the end of the video or I'll convince you that you don't actually want an iPod after all. All right, so moving on. Here are some questions I can answer. Which iPod can do this? Which iPod can do that? There are over 20 different models of iPods, and they all do wildly different things. So here's a chart of all the features broken down by generation. This first chart outlines all the features for the original iPods, which are sometimes commonly referred to as the iPod Classics, the iPod Mini, and the iPod Shuffles. Now, one thing I want to point out, you'll notice that all of these iPods can play music. And that's because these are dedicated music players. That was the original intent and the whole reason Apple made them to begin with. But when I say it can play music, I want to be really specific with what I mean. The iPod can only support 7 file types when it comes to audio files. And that is going to be MP3, AAC, M4A, M4B, which are audiobooks, AIFF, WAV, and ALAC. Those last 3 are all lossless file types. You're probably already familiar with MP3 since it's the most popular file type and it's pretty much synonymous when it comes to digital audio files. However, you probably never heard of some of these other file types before because they are specific to the Apple ecosystem. So just know if your music library is not in one of these supported file formats, you will need to convert them in order to play on the iPod successfully. One last thing about this chart I want to point out is the fact that Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, and speakers are not available on any of these iPod models. So just know if you want to listen to music on these devices, you will need to either get wired headphones or a special adapter to make your wireless Bluetooth headphones work. This next chart goes over the iPod Nano, which is kind of the next evolution in a much more compact form of iPod. You'll notice that all of these will support audio and photos. However, we've also expanded on a couple of the other features. Some of them include cameras, FM radio tuners, and even a touchscreen in the later versions. One last thing I want to point out is that 7th Gen Nano is going to include Bluetooth. So if that's important to you, this may be a model you'll want to consider. Finally, this last chart is for the iPod Touch. These are the last generations of iPods to exist before they discontinued them. They came in 7 different generations, and you'll notice that they are rich in features, including things like Wi-Fi, touchscreen, and even iOS apps and streaming. That's because at the end of the day, iPod Touches were pretty much iPhones without the phone and text capabilities. So just keep in mind that if you are thinking about getting an iPod Touch, you may already have a lot of this functionality built into your smart device. Which brings us to our next question. Which iPod should I buy? There's a really handy guide from a user called Yuiko, and it has guided many iPod owners on which iPod they should buy. I recommend checking out if you haven't already. Here's the link, and you can also find it in the description of this video. I've taken the liberty of summarizing all the information of that guide into a few slides and a good old-fashioned tier list. I'm not going to drag this tier list out, so here it is. Take a screenshot if you want to get a closer look. But if you want to understand these rankings, I'll be going over my reasoning in the next few slides. The iPod that's most recommended for beginners would have to be the 5th generation. This was the first model to support video playback and click wheel games. It's also the generation that put iPod on the map. iPods were a thing before, but after the 5th generation came out, this thing was everywhere. Movies, television shows, music videos. This was the must-have gift of 2005. Some people also claim that the 5.5 generation has a better DAC, or digital analog converter. This is the chip that converts your digital audio files into analog sound coming out of your headphones. But that's completely up to you. I personally can't hear a difference, but then again, I'm not an audiophile. Some other things to keep in mind when it comes to the 5th generation. This has the most availability of aftermarket parts. Again, after this exploded onto the scene, a lot of third-party manufacturers scrambled to make cases, faceplates, click wheels, backplates, all sorts of different colors, all sorts of different options. It also has the largest selection of aftermarket batteries. So if you intend on doing some mods, you can actually expand the amount of battery life that you have by putting in a bigger battery. So for these reasons, if you're a beginner, I absolutely have to recommend the 5th gen to you. A close second to the 5th gen in the B tier would have to be the 6th and 7th generation, also known as the iPod Classic. You'll notice that this looks almost exactly the same as the 5th gen, and in fact, a lot of the internals are also very similar to the 5th gen. However, this one is going to feature an aluminum faceplate, which actually makes it more durable, and it also comes in some aftermarket colors. And because this was the last generation of iPods to come out, it actually had some more modern features. For instance, the 6.5 and 7th generation supported inline controls. That means if you have headphones with buttons on them, you can actually use them to control the playback and volume of your music. Another factor to consider about the iPod Classic is that it's the most popular model of iPod and therefore the easiest to find. That's because when the Classic came out in 2007, they really stopped developing and making new models, and they just kept selling the same model until 2014. Which means if you're looking for a pre-owned iPod for sale, odds are it's going to be an iPod Classic. However, it's not all gravy. There are some bad things about the iPod Classic that I have to mention. This is considered to be one of the hardest iPod models to open. That's because of the aluminum faceplate. Because it's a little less flexible than the normal plastic faceplates, this requires a lot of force in order to get open. It can also be a little bit dangerous because some of the tools used are imprecise and sharp. Don't believe me? You can look online for some iPod tutorials from expert modders, and even they'll tell you that this was difficult to open and they may have accidentally cut their hands open by mistake. So beware. Lastly, the 6th and 6.5 generations have a cap at 128 gigabytes, which should be fine if you don't intend on using that much storage. However, if you are going to be flash modding this past 128 gigabytes, just know that there's an additional step where you'll have to manually flash the latest firmware upgrade to get past that cap. And for those two reasons, that's why this model is in second place. The last iPod model that I would recommend for beginners would have to be the iPod mini, which came in 2 different generations. This was the first model to feature the click wheel, which was so popular that it was used in every subsequent iPod design. It also had several different colors. To tell the difference between the 1st gen and the 2nd gen, the top row you'll notice has the click wheel with the gray text, and the bottom in the 2nd gen, they have colored text to match the color of the iPod. I'm recommending the iPod mini because it is easy to open and very cheap to modify. Although it does have an all aluminum casing, the top and the bottom are made of plastic and they're simply glued on, which means with enough patience and prying, you can easily open it. You can also use some isopropyl alcohol to dissolve the adhesive if you want a real easy way to get in. Finally, the flash mod only requires one adapter. So unlike the other iPods, which require lots of several different parts, this one is just going to be a simple CF to SD adapter, which only costs $25. The only downside to the Mini would have to be the battery. Because the form factor is so compact and tight, there's no way of getting a larger battery in there. You can still find plenty of replacement batteries to fit in, but it won't be able to exceed the normal battery life. Speaking of battery life, I also may not want to recommend the 1st gen because it has worse battery life than the 2nd, and it also has that similar cap of 128 gigabytes. The 2nd generation doesn't have either of these weaknesses, so if you can, go for the 2nd gen. And those are all the iPods that I'd recommend for beginners. If you're a bit more experienced, there are a couple of other iPods that you may want to consider. The iPod 4th generation is great, but not for the faint of heart. That's because it came in lots of different variations, including the click wheel, the photo, and the with color display. This was the first model to feature a color LCD display. However, this could only be used to display photos, and it did not support video playback yet. It also debuted the special U2 edition, which added some additional colors. The U2 edition comes in black with a red click wheel. So if you wanted to make some modifications now, you can mix and match and have more options in terms of colors. On to the cons. Because this came in so many different revisions, it can be hard to identify which iPod you're looking at, and therefore if you need some replacement parts, it can be hard to find the right compatible pieces. Also, battery replacements and upgrades are possible. However, it can be really hard to find some of these since they are so old. So you're more than likely just going to be using the regular size battery, and if you're lucky enough to find a larger battery, snag it before somebody else does. An even more challenging iPod model would have to be the 3rd generation. Now, this was the first model to feature the 30-pin port, which all other iPods use for charging and syncing. However, since this was the first generation to feature it, there were some bugs. You could use a 30-pin to USB cable to do the data sync. However, if you wanted to charge this, you had to use a 30-pin to FireWire cable instead. That's because USB charges at 5 volts, but FireWire charges at 12 volts. And you guessed it, this iPod needs 12 volts in order to charge. Now, if you've never heard of FireWire, or never seen it before, this is actually so old that it predates USB-A. So before everybody had USB-A, FireWire was one of your many options. Here's an example of what the specialty FireWire cable looks like. Notice that the end of the port is different than the USB. Unlike the rectangular design, it has a bit more of a pentagon-y design. I should also note that these cables do not come cheap. You could find a third-party aftermarket cable for about $20, but an original Apple FireWire cable is going to cost upwards to $50. So again, I would not recommend this to beginners because that cable is going to be difficult to find, but required to charge. There are some good things about the 3rd gen though. I've found this to be the cheapest iPod to find today due to its low demand. In fact, there are a lot of 3rd gens that are mistaken for broken. So if you look for a 3rd gen online and you search for broken or 4 parts, odds are it still works. But again, due to that dreaded FireWire cable charge, a lot of people don't realize that they're unable to charge it with their USB cable and just write it off as a dead product. So if you're looking to save a buck and you want to take a risk, buy one of those broken 3rd gens and odds are it'll charge up once you have the FireWire cable. But again, keep in mind that FireWire cable is expensive, so is it really a good deal? I guess it all evens out in the end. A couple more cons on the 3rd gen though. I personally found that the flash mod on this model is spottier than it is on other models. That's because this one is really picky in terms of what type of adapters and what type of SD cards you can use. Compare this to the 5th gen, where every adapter and SD card I've tried has worked without fail. And then finally, this actually has the worst battery life of any iPod. Seriously, even the smaller and older iPods get you at least 10 hours. 8 hours is barely enough to get you through the school day. And just like with the 4th gen, battery replacements and upgrades are possible, but it's going to be pretty hard to track down a bigger battery. So if you find one, snatch it right away. This next iPod is only for the real Apple fanboys because it is going to be a doozy. That's going to be the 1st and 2nd generation iPods, the original iPods. If you haven't seen this before, the 1st gen is the only model to feature a scroll wheel, which means it actually spins around, unlike the touch wheels that these newer iPods have. And the 2nd generation was the one to actually introduce that touch design. Why don't I recommend the original iPod? Well, if you recall from the last slide, the 3rd gen was the first model to introduce that 30-pin port. So the 1st and 2nd generation didn't have it. That means it required a FireWire cable to both charge and sync. This is what that port looks like, and at least the good news is this one can use a FireWire to FireWire cable, which are actually a little bit cheaper and easier to find. However, it also means that you're going to need to have a computer that supports FireWire, and believe me, that's really hard to find. They've stopped making FireWire adapters, which means your only bet is to get a computer with existing FireWire cables in order to sync and add music onto it. Another problem with having outdated tech like this is that the hard drive caps out at 20 gigabytes. So even though you can find a 30 or 40 gigabyte hard drive to fit into this body, the firmware doesn't recognize anything past 20 gigabytes. And that size is too small for most people to work with. Now, flash modding is possible, but it requires a lot of additional steps since you can't perform it with this iPod alone. In fact, you're gonna need an additional surrogate iPod to do the syncing. I've done it myself, and it's a real dance every time I want to add new songs to it. Finally, this is one of the rarest and therefore most expensive models, and parts are even rarer. So in the event that you do have a working first or second gen and it breaks down, you might as well end up buying a second one altogether. This one is for serious collectors only. Finally, we've barely scratched the surface in terms of iPod models, but the rest of them I just cannot recommend for anyone. That's going to include all of the shuffles, all of the nanos, and all the iPod touches. The main reason being, these are virtually impossible to modify and upgrade. Meaning, once these old pieces of tech crap out, they're done for. You're going to have to buy an entirely new replacement. But let me explain some additional cons that these models have. The iPod Shuffle, as you can see, has no screen. So good luck picking the song you want to listen to. It's called the Shuffle because it has a little switch which basically shuffles all your song, and that's the way they intend for you to use it. Just listening on random mode. It also requires a very unique sync and charge cable because these things are too small for the 30-pin port. So you actually had to connect it via USB and the headphone jack to charge and sync the Shuffle. Next are the Nanos, which are so small and compact that they are almost impossible to open. It's also very risky because if these get the expanded battery, aka the spicy pillow, there's not enough room for it to grow, so it'll usually just end up snapping some parts, most likely the display. A lot of Nano owners consider that spicy pillow to be a death sentence for their device. Finally, there's the iPod Touch. Again, these are practically like iPhones, so these are really hard to open because everything is soldered together and really compact. It also runs iOS, which isn't necessarily a con, but again, if you're looking to buy an iPod anyways, you're probably not looking for another iPhone clone. You're probably looking for something that's a bit more dedicated, so I wouldn't recommend this. Just get a new iPhone. And that is my long-winded way of answering which iPod should I buy. While we're on the topic of buying an iPod, the next natural question you may have is, how much should I pay? Now, luckily for you, I've been doing a lot of shopping for iPods lately, so I have a good idea of how much these things are going for. Unfortunately, popularity is always surging and changing when it comes to iPods, so I can't give you any firm numbers. Right now, iPod prices are at an all-time high because everyone is scrambling to buy them before the school year starts. I have a feeling they're going to go down again in the fall, and then they may go up once again during the winter holidays. So instead of looking at numbers that could change, I've placed these iPods in order of cheapest to most expensive. It's a completely unscientific chart, but as you can see in the line at the bottom, $1 sign is going to be the cheapest, going all the way up to $5 signs, which is going to be the most expensive. Now, some of these iPod models are going to be priced similarly. So here's my, again, not drawn to scale chart here. I mentioned earlier that third gens are probably going to be the cheapest. So if you want to find that good deal, that's the one you're going to get. Just don't forget about that FireWire charger, which again could jack the prices right back up to where like the fourth or the fifth gens are. Now the iPod minis do come in those two generations, but most people can't tell the difference, so they usually don't put a price difference. You can expect to find these going for the same price. Same idea goes for the 4th gen. Most folks aren't turning these on and they don't even know if they're selling you a monochrome or a color screen. So if you search for 4th gen, you're likely to find them for the same price. The only exception is going to be that U2 special edition, because people know that because it's black and red, there's something special and therefore more rare about it. So you might be paying a little bit more for that. That does it for kind of our bargain iPods. Let's go ahead and take a look at our more expensive premium iPods. So we have the 5th and 5.5 generation iPod, which again are going to be priced pretty much the same because most people can't tell a difference upon just looking at it. And again, I can't hear the difference with the Wolfson DAC anyways, so you shouldn't stress out too much between the 5th and 5.5 generation. The 6th, 6.5, and 7th generations are going to be a little bit pricier because most people know that the aluminum finish means that's one of the newer, more recent iPods. And I don't know why, because most people can't tell, but a lot of folks do price the 7th gens more expensive than the 6 and the 6.5 gens. They know it so much that they're even mistakenly listing regular 6 gens as 7th gens. I guess just by doing a quick search, they can tell that 7th gens are some of the most expensive. So to try to extract maximum value, they will price their 7th gens above the 6th gens. Just know again that sometimes people will list regular 6 gens as 7th gens accidentally or mistakenly. So you're going to have to do your research and search the serial number just to make sure that it is actually a 7th gen that you're paying extra for. And on rare occasions, the opposite may happen. You may find a 7th gen mistakenly listed as a 6th gen, in which case you might be able to get a little bit of a deal. And like I mentioned before, last but not least, the 2nd and the 1st gens are by far going to be the most expensive iPods you can find. And that just has to do with the fact that they're old and rare. Again, these are 25 years old. They didn't sell too well, so therefore there's just going to be a smaller inventory of them going around. So there you have it, a bit of a price comparison here. I think it's funny that this doesn't really even correlate with popularity or recommendations. So make it that what you will, and good luck finding a deal. All right, last question I'm going to address while we're on the topic of shopping is going to be the question, where can I buy an iPod? Now, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to break character for a second just because this is one of the most frequently, commonly asked questions. It's also the hardest ones to answer because I don't think anyone is going to be able to answer this question for you in a correct or helpful way. And that's just because you have to remember that iPods are like 20 years old, so you can't think about this like getting a good deal on any electronics. Because these are old collectibles, you really have to consider getting an iPod like shopping for vintage clothes or out of print collectibles or like classic cars. There's just no one answer. And more importantly, no one is out here buying multiple iPods. Okay, like if you think about it, I buy an iPod and then I bought it. And I may have bought it from like one guy. So I understand where you're coming from because you're just looking for a safe, reputable, cheap place to get a deal. But, the guy I bought an iPod from only had one iPod and now he has 0 iPods. So like with most things, you got to do the research and the shopping yourselves. And like with most of these collectibles, it's not going to be from some store. It's going to be from a second-hand marketplace like OfferUp, Facebook Marketplace, eBay, or Craigslist. Now, if you've ever used one of these sites before, you already know there's like a whole science and system behind it. I don't have time to go over giving you tips on how to find a good deal on Facebook Marketplace or on eBay. You just got to learn from experience. And more importantly, a lot of these sites are not necessarily safe. They do have some scammers behind them. So please work with an adult. But again, the last person you should be asking is some stranger on the internet because, I bought my iPod on OfferUp and now it's gone and that opportunity has left. You're going to have to find and make your own opportunities. So while I can't give you any concrete advice on how to buy an iPod, I can at least kind of point you and guide you towards some of the right directions and kind of give you my experience and my takes on the different places you can buy iPods. So let's use this quick little chart here to break it down on the different things that you could be buying. So for instance, if you're looking for a pre-owned iPod, I've ordered a couple of these sources in order from cheapest to most expensive, but also kind of the sketchiest to the least sketchiest. All right, so the first one is going to be the original owners. Again, that's probably how a majority of us iPod owners got our iPods. We either, got them 20 years ago, or we got it as a hand-me-down from our folks a while ago, or we bought it from the original owner on OfferUp or Facebook Marketplace. Now, the best thing about these original owners is that they're not really looking to maximize profit. They probably found it in an old shoebox somewhere, and instead of just throwing it away, they thought they'd extract and get a little bit of extra chump change for this. So if you can be patient and track down an original owner listing their iPod for sale on like OfferUp or Facebook Marketplace, message them, be polite, find a nice public place to meet up, and you'll get yourself a good deal. The next best place to buy a pre-owned iPod is going to be through a thrift store or by some of these flippers who buy a lot of e-waste and a lot of junk and then have a high inventory of iPods to sell. Now, the reason why this is next best is that, thrift shops and flippers, they're not trying to hang on to these iPods. So again, they're not trying to extract maximum value. They just want to make a little bit of extra money than they spent. Now, most thrift stores get iPods for free as donations, but they also go quick. So that's why you got to be really quick and check those thrift stores often to get a good deal and get it from them. Now, flippers, on the other hand, if you search for an iPod, you're going to find a flipper. And the only downside here is that they're trying to make a little bit of profit as well. So if they got it for 50, they're going to sell it to you for 75. If they got it for 100, they're going to sell it to you for 150, etc. And also when it comes to thrift shops and flippers, you're not going to know exactly what the iPod's been through. Could have been sitting in a closet somewhere, or could have been sitting at the bottom of a fish tank. You just don't know, so it's always going to involve a little bit of more risk. Lastly, the most expensive place you can get a pre-owned iPod is from an iPod specialist. Now, I know this is a little counterintuitive because you think, oh, well, if this is a shop or a business that specializes in iPods, why wouldn't they want to give me a good deal? That's because they can afford to sit on the inventory. They have customers coming to them at a regular basis, so they really have no incentive to give you a good deal. They have all the leverage. They also know the trends. So if they start to see prices go up, they're going to adjust all of their rates to match the going rate. So iPod Specialist is going to be a very secure place to get an iPod, but just know you will be paying the most. Next, we got to talk about parts. Now, here's the most important thing you have to know about parts. At the end of the day, they all come from some company in China. Even back when Apple was selling iPods, Apple got all their parts from some company in China. That's why the cheapest price you're going to find is going to be from a Chinese company like AliExpress or some eBay store based in China. The next best option is to source them from broken pre-owned iPods. So if you need like two parts for your iPod, like you need a click wheel and a screen, instead of buying those two pieces separately, just search online for a broken iPod and hope that the screen and the click wheel still work. Because if you buy them together, you'll actually end up saving money in the long run. And then finally, once again, I put iPod Specialists at the bottom because again, like I mentioned, iPod Specialists are getting their parts from the same two places. And then what they do in turn is they sell it back to you and make a little bit of a profit. So don't be fooled by some of these iPod specialty stores and their marketing. These guys are not manufacturing iPod replacement parts. There's no way they could be. Instead, they are just getting them from China or getting them from broken iPods anyways. You might as well cut out the middle person and do the job yourself. Finally, if you don't want to do this work and you just want to get an iPod that's already been pre-modded, you can also look for these online. And again, here's my rankings and recommendations. So I'm putting the Chinese company at the top again because it's going to be the cheapest place to get a modded iPod. These Chinese companies have all the parts, so it wouldn't be much extra effort for them to put these parts together onto a modded iPod. The only caveat is they probably won't be doing any QCing, so these can be a little bit trickier. If you're not afraid to open up these pre-modded iPods and maybe do a little bit of correcting yourself, this is a great deal. Otherwise, if you're afraid to jump in there and to check the wiring or check the way that they've done the setup, you may want to steer clear of the Chinese companies that are selling modded iPods. The next best option is going to be a hobbyist. Now, what defines a hobbyist versus an iPod specialist? Well, a hobbyist is usually doing this just for fun. The majority of people that buy and collect iPods don't do it to use them and listen to music. You only really need one iPod for that. They keep buying them because iPods are kind of fun to take apart and to fix up. And at the end of the day, these hobbyists don't need to be sitting on 10, 20 different iPods. So every once in a while, they will sell their inventory on eBay. So since it's kind of more of like a mutual ecosystem, they are more willing to give you a deal. They just want to spread the enthusiasm and love for iPods, and they only want to get paid for their labor. And again, the most expensive place you can get a pre-modded iPod is from one of those iPod specialty stores. Now here's the good news. These folks have probably modded more iPods than anyone. They're also doing a lot of testing and QCing to certify that they are selling you a good product. But again, the bad news is everything from the testing to the website to the photos, that all takes time and money. And these type of companies are going to pass those costs onto you. So while you will be getting a quality product, again, you will be paying the top dollar. And if you don't mind that, if you want that peace of mind, by all means, buy it from these iPod specialty stores. But if you're not afraid to get a little bit more technical, I would highly recommend buying a pre-owned iPod and fixing it up yourself. And that's all I have to say about buying an iPod. All right, time to talk about a not so fun question. Why doesn't my iPod work? If you've bought an iPod and you can't get it to work properly, I know it can be frustrating. So what I'm going to do in this section is go over some of the common occurrences that iPods can encounter and hopefully help you diagnose the issue so you can quickly troubleshoot it and get your iPod up and running once again. Now, what I have here is a breakdown of all the different parts of an iPod. Your iPod may look different depending on the version or model that you have, but at the end of the day, they all add up to the same 6 pieces here. In the center, you have the motherboard or logic board, and you could think of this like the head of the iPod. The rest of these other parts are kind of like the limbs, and they all work together to make sure your iPod functions properly. Now, the good news is when an iPod stops working, it's usually only due to one part that either is no longer functioning or needs to be reconnected properly. The bad news is it can be a little bit tricky identifying which part that actually is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over some common issues with the iPods not working and then help you narrow down which part it may be that needs to be either reseated or replaced completely. Let's go ahead and begin with the most basic and common issue. Your iPod doesn't turn on. So if your iPod isn't turning on, it's usually down to one of two things. Either the battery needs to be replaced or the motherboard is broken and just isn't functioning at all. Now, let me just say straight out that at any point, the motherboard could be the issue. I mean, like I mentioned, the motherboard is like the brain. So if the motherboard is broken, nothing's going to work. However, it is very unlikely that the motherboard would be broken simply because these things are pretty static and they kind of just sit there in the middle of the case, not doing much. They really just pass electricity through its circuits. So unless something really went wrong and there was a short, your motherboard is likely good. I would encourage you to try fixing or replacing other parts before you resort to getting a new motherboard, since that's going to be the most expensive part. Getting a new motherboard is like getting a whole new iPod altogether. So when an iPod doesn't turn on, replace the battery. These things are only $10 or $15 anyways, and it is the most common cause for your iPod issues. So if you are buying a pre-owned iPod, you should factor in a new battery as part of the cost, since I consider it a requirement. Now, let's say it does turn on, but you can't see anything. Sometimes you can tell that it's on because you can hear some noises and you can hear it whirring around, but the screen isn't turning on. In that case, it's just going to be your display that needs to be replaced. Again, this could mean that the motherboard has an issue sending a signal to the display itself. However, it's much more likely that the display has burnt out over the 20 years and simply needs to be replaced. Next, let's say your iPod turns on, you can see a screen, but when you plug it in, it's not being recognized by the computer. Now, this is most likely an issue with the hard drive. Now, just like the battery, the hard drive is something you should consider replacing, especially with the flash mod. And that's because, again, these things are 20 years old. They weren't meant to last this long. And if it goes broken, it can cause issues like not being able to be recognized by the computer. Some additional issues that could be caused by the hard drive. If it doesn't boot up, meaning it does turn on, but it never fully opens up the menu, that's probably because the hard drive is faulty. It cannot load the iPod OS. Now, even after you've replaced the hard drive with the flash mod, just know that you still may see some issues. For instance, if the iPod keeps rebooting when you try to turn it on, it could mean that the battery does not have enough juice to fully boot it up, or it could mean that something went wrong with the iPod restoration process and you need to do it over again. In fact, if you see one of these error messages, it means that the hard drive does not have the proper files and you need to go through a restore. Now, let's say the iPod does turn on and boots up successfully, but you can't navigate the menu. Sometimes it could be an issue with the click wheel. The click wheel is like your keyboard or your controller. So if you're spinning it around and it's not moving up and down on the menu, simply means that everything's working properly, but the click wheel needs to be replaced. And then finally, if everything's working, it turns on, it boots up, you're able to navigate through the menu and click through and select your songs, but you can't hear any music, it's most likely the headphone assembly that needs to be replaced. Now, this is actually pretty common because the headphone is actually one of the few parts that are exposed to the elements. So unlike everything else, which is kind of hermetically sealed internally, the headphone jack is going to be exposed to heat and moisture. It can rust over time. So it's not uncommon for older iPods to need to have a headphone assembly replaced. So there you have it. Here's a list of the most common issues that I see asked every day on the iPod subreddit. And here are some of the solutions that you can try out. Now, if you want to learn more about how you can actually replace these parts and fix them, you can do additional research. I don't have time to go over it, but there's plenty of useful tutorials you can find online. Building off of our last question, another question that gets asked a lot is my battery cooked? And the answer is just going to be yes. Emphatically, I don't even need to look at your iPod to know that if it's not turned on properly, your battery is an issue and it needs to be replaced. That's because these batteries were not meant to last this long. And remember, these iPods are over 20 years old. You should also be aware that battery expansion, aka the spicy pillows, they're caused by extreme temperatures, overcharging, and say it with me, aging. So odds are, if you got an iPod that's been laying around in a garage or an attic somewhere, it's probably been getting a lot of extreme temperatures. Hot in the summer, cold in the winter. And then when you got it and tried to charge it for the first time, you probably left it charged overnight, which again can cause overcharging. You should just replace these batteries as soon as possible, no questions asked, because if you don't, you may get this issue. A lot of folks post this type of image and they say, is something going on with my screen? What's the issue? The issue is that on this model of iPod, right behind the screen is the battery. And like I mentioned, these 20-year-old batteries, they've gone through it. They've seen a lot. So when you try to use them and charge them after all that time, they are going to expand and it will press the screen against the plastic faceplate, which is what causes that black blemish. All right. If you haven't seen a spicy pillow before, that's what it looks like. That is literally gas that is accumulated over time and it is bursting to get out. This is highly dangerous because that gas is flammable. And if you don't properly dispose of it, this can cause an explosion or a fire. And you don't want that. So again, any old iPod, any old electronics whatsoever, if there's a lithium ion battery in there that's over 10 years old, do yourself a favor, just take it out. Similarly, is my hard drive cooked? Again, I don't even need to look at your hard drive to know, yeah, it's probably bad. That's because hard disk drives, the ones that have the mechanical spinning parts, they're meant to last only 3 to 5 years on average. And again, iPods with the hard disk drives stopped being made in 2014. So best case scenario, your hard drive is 10 years old, which is still way too long to still be functioning. I also don't think some of you understand how fragile these hard disk drives are. You know, there's a reason why we stopped using them, and that's because shaking it a couple times can simply break it. I remember they used to sell these armbands for the iPod so people can go jogging. However, it ended up breaking a lot of people's iPods because when you're jogging, you're kind of running back and forth and shaking your arm, and all of a sudden, your hard drive spins out of place or gets a little scratch, and that destroys it. That's just how fragile these hard drives are. I've seen a lot of people post in their smart data scans, and they aren't able to interpret it, or they post their smart data scans and there's like all zeros and they think this is great. Look at this. Look at how lucky I am to get this fresh hard drive. At the end of the day, these are not reliable and you can't depend on them. Even if it says that there's 0 reallocations, you should realize that those numbers are based on an inactive drive. Meaning, of course, there's going to be 0 reallocations. It hasn't been used in the last 20 years. However, once you start using again, the hard drive is going to try to read certain sectors and then encounter the bad ones. That's what turns in the reallocations. So just because there's 0 today, you can maybe get 2-3 months of good use out of it before it starts running into those bad sectors that have just aged over time. So if you're going to be opening your iPod to change out the battery anyways, you might as well perform the flash mod while you have it open. In case you haven't seen it before, this is what a hard drive looks like. As you can see, there are a lot of moving parts, and every single moving part is just an opportunity for failure. And the hard drives for the iPods were compact laptop size, meaning they're even smaller and therefore the parts are even weaker. So do not delay on this. I know it can be pricey, but it's going to save you a lot of headache in the long run if you just replace your hard drive, regardless of how good you think it's functioning now. Again, these hard drives are 20 years old. What's the difference between replacing a 20-year-old hard drive and a 20-year and 3-month-old hard drive? All right, this next question I've been kind of dreading answer, and that is, how do I put music onto my iPod? The reason I've been dreading this is that, it's so funny. iPods seem to only really make sense to millennials and Gen X. So if you're like under the age of 20 or over the age of 50, iPods just don't make any sense. And I'm going to explain why. Just so you know, there is a very particular way of putting music onto your iPod, and it is complicated. It's so complicated that, it's the main reason why people stop using iPods. It just became such a pain and a hassle. So I just want to preface this by saying it's a little bit complicated, and I can't even go into a lot of the details just because of all the different screenshots and steps involved. I'm just going to talk about a high level because I need you to understand this is the process with like diagrams and arrows. And if this is something that you want to undertake, then you can search online for some more in-depth, detailed tutorials. I just want to kind of outline it for you high level, so that you know what you're getting yourself into, so you can make the decision of whether or not you want to get an iPod or not. All right, so first of all, when we're talking about getting music at your iPod, we're going to talk about the fact that these are going to be digital audio files. And how do you even get digital audio files to begin with? Again, if you're between the ages of 21 to 49, you probably understand this. You've probably done this in some way, shape, or form. But again, if you are more used to the era of like tapes and CDs, and then fast forward to the era of like streaming, you probably never had to deal with digital audio files or how to obtain them. So let me kind of explain the two main ways. The first way is going to be to download them from the internet. Apple actually used to have an online store called the iTunes store where artists could host their music and then you can download it for like $1. And then nowadays they have websites like Bandcamp, which is kind of similar. Artists can host their music and you can download it and it goes straight to the artist, which is great. The only thing to keep in mind is that this does start to really pile up. So if you think about things like your storage space on your computer, it's not uncommon to have like 50 gigabytes worth of music. So just be aware that that's like a whole other thing you have to navigate. The other way of obtaining this, and this is again going to be for like our Gen X and boomers, you can rip them from your CDs. So if you or your family has a large CD collection, you already own that music, so you should be able to do whatever you want with those digital files. And again, using iTunes, you can actually do a process called ripping, which is basically when you extract all the digital files and then you encode them into your digital audio library. All right, so now that you have digital audio files, how do you get them onto your iPod? Now, I know what you're thinking. Hey, I'm not that tech illiterate. I know how to get files from one drive to another. I just have to copy and paste it or drag and drop it, right? I just have to write it from one place to another. Well, in most cases, you'd be right. But unfortunately, when it comes to the iPod, this is incorrect. You can't simply just write music onto your iPod, I'm sad to say. I mean, technically you can. The iPod has a hard drive and you're able to put whatever files you want on there, but that'd be the same as taking a record player and simply resting the record on top of it. It's on the record player, but you won't be able to listen to the music. There's a very specific way of getting music to play on the record player, right? You have to insert it onto the carousel. You have to drop the needle onto the grooves and spin it. Same thing goes for the iPod. There's a very particular way you have to get these digital audio files onto the iPod in order to get it to play successfully. And that's going to involve iTunes or Apple Music. Now, I know most of you think of iTunes or Apple Music as like a music streaming service. It's a place where you can find all the songs and listen to them. But before that, it was actually a music library application that allowed you to manage and organize all of your digital audio files. What you would do is you would import them into your iTunes or music library. And then from there, they are synced to your Apple account. So for instance, if I have all these CDs that I downloaded, I'm going to import them into iTunes, and then iTunes says, okay, John Smith's account now has Taylor Swift, it now has Drake, it now has Kendrick Lamar. So now that iTunes recognizes that I own those songs, it then authorizes my iPod to have them. You can think about your iPod as like your portable iTunes library. So this is done through a process called syncing. And the syncing really just happens one way. It's being able to copy all of the songs from our iTunes library onto our iPod. And again, that's just for validation reasons, just to make sure that that's music that I technically own and that I'm not able to take music from my iPod and share it with all my friends. You have to remember that Apple used to sell the songs, so it was in their best interest to make sure that there was no illegal file sharing, and they prevented it by using this sync process. I know another commonly asked question is, how do I get music out of my iPod? And there's lots of tutorials you can look up online. Technically, it's not supported by Apple, so you may have to get third-party software. And that's why I don't want to talk about it in this video. But in terms of how to get music onto your iPod, just look at this diagram. It's a little bit crazy, a lot of additional steps. So just be aware. Feel free to look up some additional tutorials to see the steps. But if this is already looking like it's a bit more complicated than you're used to, a lot more complicated than like using streaming, the iPod may not be something you'd want to use. All right, now that you understand the complicated process of getting music onto your iPod, if you're still on board with this and you still would like to do this, it's time to answer the final question, which is, which mods should I do? Over the past 20 years, a lot of advancements have happened in technology. And one of the great things about this community is that they have figured ways to bring iPods into the 2020s through the form of modifications. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rank these modifications in order from easiest to hardest, and again, give you my recommendations and my takes on them. First off, and I've already touched upon this one several times earlier in this video, it's going to be the storage or the flash mod. Now, I already talked about how often hard drives can fail. So instead of getting a replacement hard drive, what you should do instead is the flash mod, which is basically taking a solid state disk like an SD card and letting your iPod run through that instead of that old mechanical disk. As far as mods go, this is probably the most expensive, but it's also one of the easiest and again, totally necessary, simply because you don't want to be replacing your hard drive every few years. You just want to replace it once and be done with it. Solid state disks have no moving parts, so while they may fail, it's much less frequent. And flash memory is also much cheaper these days. I am willing to bet that you have an old SD card lying around not being used, so all you really need is one of these adapters to be able to get your iPod to read and write on the SD card successfully. So cannot recommend the flash mod enough. Next one, like I said, is going to be the battery replacement or the battery upgrade. Once you perform that flash mod, it is going to take up considerably less space than the original hard drive, which is going to open you up to a larger battery. Now, iPods had great battery life before, but if you're going to get a battery that's twice as large, that means you can get up to twice as much battery life. The most options are going to be for the 5th, 6th, and 7th gens. So if you need help navigating what size battery is going to fit into which iPod, again, there's lots of other tutorials online that you can look up. Some folks have even tested out different flash adapters with different battery sizes. They know exactly how to make it fit. But when in doubt, go a size smaller. These iPods get great battery life anyways, so I really wouldn't be splitting hairs over like 40 and 50 hours of battery life. The next cool mod you should do is the housing color swap. Now, this is mostly available for the 5th, 6th, and 7th gens, but a lot of these old iPods are kind of dinged up and scratched up anyways, so you'll want to replace the faceplate and the backplate to something that's new. And if you're going to get something new, you might as well personalize it with some of these colors. The more you mix and match, the more likely you're going to have an iPod that's one of a kind and made just for you. So these 3 mods are some of the easiest, and I would recommend anybody try them out. But these next few mods are going to be a little bit more complicated because they do require soldering. First one I want to talk about is going to be the haptic feedback mod. Now, a lot of the modern touchscreen devices, they have what we call haptic feedback, which means it's a little vibration whenever you tap or scroll through their interface. The iPod does have that touch wheel, but there's no vibration feedback. So if you'd like, you can take one of these Taptic engines from an old iPhone. You can actually just buy the parts for like a few bucks, and you can solder it into the iPod. So that way, whenever you are scrolling through your iPod, you get a satisfying vibration confirmation that you're navigating through the screens. It's not necessary, but it is kind of fun to have. And again, it just makes your iPod feel new and up to date. Another mod that a lot of people do is the Bluetooth chip mod. I mentioned earlier that those old iPods do not support Bluetooth. However, you can open it up and solder in one of these Bluetooth chips, which is going to allow for you to connect your Bluetooth headphones to your iPod and listen wirelessly. Again, this is really tricky, and that chip is deceptively small, so some soldering skill is going to be required. But there's also some folks online that are selling pre-made Bluetooth chips. I've never tried it, so I can't recommend it, but you can definitely do some more research to find a way to get the Bluetooth chip onto your iPod a little more easily. And then finally, these last two mods are very difficult. I actually would not recommend doing this unless you are very experienced with modifications. The first one is the LCD or LED mod. And what that allows you to do is change the color of some of the lights on your iPod device. Here's the third gen, and the screen is usually white and the buttons are usually red. But what you can do is you can actually open up the LCD screen and put in a color gel to change the color of the screen. And then for those LED lights, you can actually desolder them and then resolder new LED lights to change the color. The reason why I put 2 asterisks on this mod is that this could potentially permanently damage your iPod. If you're not familiar with LCD screens, they have several different layers and they can be pretty fragile. So if you are opening them up and you're being uncareful, you could crack the screen and break it entirely. Same thing with these LED mods. Because you're desoldering off of the touchpad, if you desolder the wrong thing or short something out, you can break those buttons or at least break the lights and never have them work again. So just want to make sure that you're aware that this is not going to be a simple modification because it's very risky. And finally, the last mod you can do is going to be the USB-C swap. Now, take a look at that image. You notice that the bottom one has a 30-pin port and the top one is actually using a USB-C port. It actually is possible to replace that 30-pin port with USB-C, which is going to support both charging and syncing. However, you have to be aware that this is going to take a lot of micro soldering. In short, you have to desolder the 30-pin port from the motherboard and then resolder a separate USB-C port using the same leads. If you even remotely understood what I just said, then you'll know how difficult that is. It's also very risky because remember, the iPod is dependent on that 30-pin port. So if you make a mistake while removing it, you may end up permanently damaging the motherboard and then having to buy a whole new replacement. There's also really no benefit of doing the USB-C swap. It doesn't charge or sync any faster. So you're really just adding the convenience of using a universal cord for like the USB cable. If you really don't mind carrying around the extra 30-pin iPod cable, I recommend not doing this mod. Too much risk for too little upside. And then finally, the last mod to talk about is going to be Rockbox. Some of you may already be familiar with Rockbox. It may be the reason why I chose to get an iPod, but as you can see from the screenshot, Rockbox is basically a replacement to the original iPod OS. This allows you to unlock some additional features and also install some custom skins to really personalize your iPod. This one does take a little bit of extra software knowledge, but I'd say if you're moderately tech savvy, the Rockbox mod is actually pretty simple to do. But just keep in mind that at any time, if you're sick of using the Rockbox, you can always jump back to the original iPod OS pretty easily. All right, and that does it for the 2 frequently asked questions about iPods. I hope I've done a good job of answering your questions, but before we wrap up, I actually have a question for you, and that is, should you still buy an iPod? Look, I know it seems like this whole video has been about me trying to discourage you from buying an iPod, but let me just come clean and be honest. All right, I've seen a lot of folks pick up iPods, try them out for a few weeks, and then abandon them. And that's normal, you know. iPods are retro for a reason. At one point, millions of people owned iPods, and at one point they set it down and they never picked it back up. What I want to see is more folks get enthusiastic and excited about the iPod and further the community and push the capabilities of what iPod modding can do. I take a look at something like the Game Boy modding community and I see how far they've gone and how advanced they can push the technology of the Game Boy. And I want the same thing for the iPod. But it's just not possible when we're always constantly resetting and having to explain to new people how to even use their iPods. Look at these three pieces of retro tech. Believe it or not, these are actually contemporary to the iPods. That's a 2004 iMac, a 2005 Dell, and a 2006 BlackBerry. If looking at retro tech like this makes you cringe, then iPods may not be for you. A lot of iPod users love tech like this. In fact, we still have and use tech like this to help support our iPods. So just realize that this is the community that you're going to be entering by getting an iPod. Also, in case it's not clearly evident by now, troubleshooting is a requirement to owning an iPod. Even if you buy one of those pre-modded iPods, these things are not made in factories. They're made by human beings, and humans can make mistakes. So even if you paid top dollar, you may still have to go under the hood to fix a loose wire or two. And again, a lot of people in this community love doing that. They specifically buy iPods so they can crack it open and make the changes. So if this is something that gives you apprehension, you may want to seek another type of music player other than an iPod that will require less work. Another stark reality about having an iPod is that every new OS is one step away from dropping iPod support. The beta for the new macOS Tahoe just came out, and people are reporting that it's dropping support for FireWire. So that means anybody with an iPod 1st gen or 2nd gen cannot use OS Tahoe. They have to have an older Mac in order to sync music onto their iPods. And while Windows 11 still supports iPods, Windows 12 is just around the corner. And who knows, that could be the day that Windows decides to stop supporting a device made from a competitor 2 decades ago. All right, this next point is a pretty sensitive one. You've probably noticed it by now if you've ever gone to Reddit for tech support, but Apple fanboys, tech bros, and audiophiles can be vicious. But remember that they know their stuff. I know whenever you're posting a question, you get some type of long-winded answer or lecture from somebody. It seems like the person you're talking to is this guy. But you have to remember that iPod owners have been using them for a long time. And in that time, they've gone through a lot of trials and tribulations. It's been painful and expensive to gather all this knowledge. And while we want to share it, it can be a little bit frustrating to answer the same questions over and over again, or worse, to have them met with disagreements and arguments. I'm not saying you have to treat us like some grand master, but just realize that we do have a lot of knowledge to impart. So as long as you ask with a little bit of patience and respect, we're happy to share it with you. It's just going to take more than one post, so it would be helpful if you also did some of your own research. And finally, if you've watched this video all the way through, that means you're serious about your research and you're serious about getting an iPod. So let me just make one last point before you leave. Modern DAPs with updated features like Bluetooth and music streaming actually are a lot cheaper than you think. Considerably cheaper than the iPod. The only 2 reasons I can think of that people still use iPods in place of a modern DAP is for nostalgia and for that cool factor that Apple has. So just realize if those are things that are important to you, you're going to be paying a premium. If you don't really care about that stuff and you just want to get a digital audio player, you can pay a fraction of the price and get none of the headaches. But again, if you don't find this tempting, if nothing I said has deterred you, then I wish you the best of luck with your new iPod. And welcome to the community. One last thing I want to say, thanks so much for watching this video. This is my first video ever, and I hope to make more to talk about iPods and other old forms of media. If there are any questions that I didn't address in this video, feel free to write a comment below. And please help me out by hitting subscribe. Again, this is my first video and I do intend to make more. So the best thing you can do for me is to hit subscribe. I won't be uploading videos too frequently, so it probably won't bother you much. But this extra click does go a long way for a new channel. I appreciate you, and I'll see you on the forums.